the data, to use all the data in real time. And again, not to say that as trials go on, then we should start all over. There shouldn't be a law against efficiency. And we should be able to have these cohorts of data that generate the evidence that we need. And that gets us back, of course, to having tools in the clinic. And that's another thing that I'm going to urge our leaders to make sure that they invest in. Sam knows this well, that we should really be thinking of one-source solutions that allow us to, we in the academic community could pioneer the way of how we think about collecting data, that it should all be not, and again, that's about credit. How we collect our data in the clinic is about billing. But instead, it should be about generating trusted, quality data that can be shared with appropriate consent. And if you'd like to see an example of that, come to poster 16 to look at one-source solutions. A little bit of future thinking, but fortunately, Cersei and Janet has supported this through the 21st Century Cures Act. But again, we have to be really thoughtful about how we make the changes in our, starting from the training of physicians and where physicians practice to really make a difference, and how data is generated so we can be all about evidence generation, and all the things that everyone's talked about in this panel can happen seamlessly. Okay, now we invite people to come to the microphones to ask us questions and start generating this. And I think I would agree with Janet and Amy that the whole context of everything, what everyone's saying, really fits very nicely into a path forward for innovation. Yes?
All of what you have suggested, and I've just have a paper online of why phase 3 trials for monoclonal antibodies, review those. All of what you have suggested really relates back to the IND. Yeah. If we change the rules for the IND, we could change many of the aspects of what you're talking about. Because I'm on the committee, I've always been on the committee at UCSF that reviews clinical studies, and we end up many times saying, this is bad science, but it's a multi-center clinical study, and the companies don't pay attention to it. So it all gets back to the IND. So if we change the rules for the IND, we could control a number of the aspects of what we think are bad science.
But Les, that's assuming that the FDA reviewers are sort of all-knowing and omniscient and know what the best science is.
No, but I'm suggesting that we don't necessarily follow the rule of what we do now for the IND. Maybe we need to re-look completely at how we do INDs, that it isn't the FDA scientists within 1 month saying, okay, I approve these studies. Maybe this needs to be a national program that we bring in experts from all areas and we completely change how we approach the IND method.
Well, can I quiz him a little? Could you be a little bit more specific? I mean,
you're on the hot seat now.
I mean, there's no bar to doing that now. It's not how people do it. It isn't the rules of the IND. Nobody says you have to do phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and all this stuff. Right. This is just a habit, okay? So, but we need, you're right, we need societal community, biomedical community discussion about how to do things differently, and some consensus, because people don't like change, as you know, both in the industry, in the clinical community, and at the FDA level. So, you need some kind of proposal to react to or something like that about how you're going to do the development program differently, I think. But there aren't fixed rules. That's mostly folklore about how you have to do things.
But Janet, I'm saying, why? Let's change the rules completely. When I review the INDs of phase 3 failures for monoclonal antibodies, most of them, not most of them, a good portion of them, companies that have nothing else and they keep doing the study even because that's all they have and it's going to be a financial aspect of it.
Yeah, but
they keep running the study from a financial reason because the company keeps going.
Yeah, but
Even
that's
though it's gonna fail.
but that's not the fault of the FDA. That's the fault of the investment community and the people who are putting money in,
The
and
investigators.
the
Laura,
investigators.
I'm saying we could change the rules of
There
how
aren't.
we allow studies to be run.
You're saying put some rules in place.
Yeah,
Maybe.
right. Put some rules in place that are completely different than what we do now.
Okay, well, that's a proposal. I just note that it would probably require congressional action. That's fine, but
And we know how easy that would be today from both houses of Congress. But it is actually one of the things that my working with the FDA, I think the most common thing I hear when you talk to companies, well, you can't do that because the FDA won't do it. I said, the FDA doesn't care about that. It's actually this common folklore and myth that this is why we do it because the FDA requires it, which is completely not true, which is one of the reasons why I think a CERC and this idea of training people in regulatory science is so important. Okay, actually, we'll take this microphone. We'll alternate microphones. Go ahead, yes, you.
Yeah, I'm Ting Pan. I'm actually a patient partner at Stanford. Okay, I'm involved with patient engagement at PCORI for quite a while. I'm glad that the patient-centeredness is being addressed, especially clinical trial. I have a question, whether there's any comment on how to get patient engagement within the development cycle. That's a much more difficult issue, and I don't know if anybody can comment on that.
Yeah. I can certainly comment on that. I couldn't agree with you more. In the iSpy trial, there are probably 100 advocates that are involved. There are advocates on every single one of our working committee, of which there are 12, including an IRB working committee, to innovate those processes. But our lead advocate is Jane Perlmutter and has been very outspoken, has been so influential. I actually think, a lot of clinicians, of course, take care of patients, so they, do have a patient voice, but having patient advocates involved early on in design and on your trials, it keeps you honest. And it keeps you from designing your trials for things that are about the wrong credit or the wrong things or for the rules, and keeps you focused on why it is you're doing this work in the first place. Anyone else want to comment?
Just one thing I might add is that, yes, I think it has been practice for most companies to involve patients and advocates as it relates to the overall development program, where I think our company has learned a lot of lessons, and me personally is actually getting into the rare disease space. And that's where the partnership is just incredible. We've recently filed for medicine in spinal muscular atrophy. And when you're dealing with families and patients and caregivers, really hand in glove with the development, I think there's a lot that we can learn as a community from rare disease and the incredible partnership there, and thinking about how that can be more fully systematized or routinized across the industry. But there really is a great paradigm and example there.
And one of the other elements inside of FDA has been patient listening sessions, and they've become increasingly more important. Practically speaking, as a clinical reviewer who's reviewing studies, oftentimes you don't know what it feels like to be a patient with this illness or a parent of a patient with this illness. And hearing from families and the individuals who are experiencing this illness every day about what this actually means to me and how this medical product may ultimately translate in my life is very important. And so we're trying to figure out how to amplify that book of work within FDA to make sure that that's well understood.
yeah, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, or CITI, has developed kind of a guideline for companies on how to get patient input throughout the drug development process. So I think that's very important for companies, and I think those are very high quality. The FDA is doing, in patient-focused drug development, we're going to issue 4 guidances about how people can develop valid and reliable and reproducible input from patients, because we know that, one person with disease doesn't represent the entire spectrum of experiences of people with disease, as well as and we're going to do on patient preferences, which I think we're going to hear about coming up. So I believe, and of course, PCORI, as you said, and I work with PCORI, they're doing a huge amount of work on this. But to get companies to have a routine of, as they start a development program, to go to the patients first and say what matters to you, what's important, when they design a trial, to say how many visits are tolerable, how long can a child tolerate a visit or a procedure, what's acceptable, would you enroll if you had this many procedures? Those are things that can head off a lot of trials that have to be aborted because nobody will enroll in them. So I think all of this is going on, and it's sort of coming together. There's a real movement about we need to make sure the patients are always a partner through every stage of the clinical stages.
Yeah, and I just would say I think it's really important that it's not a patient. Having one patient advocate is not sufficient. One thing Jane likes to say very commonly, all advocates do not agree and share the same viewpoint. So just like everything else. Okay, thanks for your comment. Next one. We're going to try and get to everyone's comments. So we'll have to be lightning up here. Yes.
My name is Jane Chang, and I work at Cypherome, which is a small biotech startup in the Bay Area. So thank you very much for talking. I have a couple of questions. One is there a role for using genetics, so pharmacogenomics, for some of these trials? Because one of the things that I realized was
Yes. There.
yes. So and how would we use that? Because one of my big concerns in this space is the underrepresentation of certain ethnicities, and I'll give you an example. So my father was getting treatment at Stanford, and he was told that there are no drugs, or there were no Asians in this randomized clinical trial for a very large, study. That surprised me. And I was thinking, how do we incorporate different ethnicities and ancestries in these clinical trials? Because for RCTs, we want to get a homogeneous population so we could get all these imperfect markers that we were discussing. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, I think that there's a lot of great discussion here, but we live in a very large world. So harmonization with EMA, other groups, how is that being done so that different ethnicities are being incorporated in these large trials so we could get drugs for them?
So I might sort of take the first and someone else can take the second one. I would say on the first issue, there's a lot of push to try and get representative populations. In fact, one of the studies I run, the Wisdom studies, really where we've incorporated genetics into the risk prediction for breast cancer, and all the polygenic risk scores are calculated differently for different ethnicities. And so it is, in fact, our job to make sure the different ethnic populations are represented. And we just got an R01 to extend our PCORI grant to do that. And we do the same thing for iSpy. You're picking different regions and different partners in different parts of the country that have different populations. That's one of the ways in which you can do it. We are working on messaging to really make sure that we do have a trial that really represents the population of the study. These are things that, and again, the more we make trials patient-centric so that people really want to participate in them, the more likely we are to get and reduce all those barriers like Sandra and others were talking about, the more likely it is that we're going to be able to make all this happen. Who wants to take on the second question?
International harmonization, yes. I mean, as you know, and this is very interesting, long ago, different countries wouldn't even accept each other's data, and yet they want a pure trial in their population. But of course, that often delayed drug development access in that country tremendously, although it might be available in other parts of the world. So through the ICH, we've been trying to harmonize this. And now we can get to a higher level, as you said, of representativeness and using populations all around the world. And certainly that's one of the ICH topics that we are continuing to work on.
Maybe I could just, say one thing about the diversity in clinical trials, and that is I do think you have to think about it at the very beginning.
Yes.
You have to think about it related to the disease. For example, we were recently having a discussion about lupus nephritis, and we know there's a disproportionate incidence in minority populations. And as we think about integrated evidence generation, everything doesn't have to be done in the first trial, or in the only trial. But it's really important as you begin to think at the beginning, how am I going to get that evidence in all of the relevant populations? What is the overall plan? And how do we do that best with the different modes at our disposal?
Hi, I'm Ann Keene. I was the former Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Achaogen, an antibiotic company that was very promising until we went bankrupt a year after our antibiotic was approved. Hopefully everybody in this room knows that the antibiotic industry is collapsing as we speak. And I just want to say a lot of the ideas that were expressed here were music to my ears. The idea of something beyond a p-value of 0.05 for serious, life-threatening acute infections for which there is no feasible development pathway, using evidence that doesn't look perfect, using a different way of collecting evidence. If we don't do something very soon, we will not have an antibiotic industry, and I think we really need some sort of a task force that brings all of this creative thinking together with the antibiotic companies that we still have, which are mostly very small and don't have the resources to do this kind of work.
You want to hit on CARB-X?
Huh?
So just to signal a little bit about that, there is a transgovernmental task force, CARB-X, really focused on antimicrobial resistance. Within FDA, we also have really specific areas of focus within each center. That being said, this is a major international issue.
Yeah, and I would just say that all of those things existed. They didn't
went
help the problem. They're not fixing the problem of there just not being a feasible regulatory pathway.
Great. We agree.
I wanted to start by saying I love the fact that we're talking so much about patient-centeredness. I also love the idea of thinking big and thinking about drawing upon the past and where policy goes. I want to follow up on one word that Dr. Abernathy mentioned, and that's trustworthiness. And I appreciated, Amy, that you used trustworthiness and not trust, because I think it is different. So this idea of bringing patients in to design an individual trial is something that we're all comfortable with, and I think we've moved. But ultimately, trustworthiness means that it's the policies that are set and the way in which we set up the structure for general design, general decision-making. And so when we begin this new decade, where might the FDA go in terms of really thinking about patient-centeredness at that larger policy and decision-making to build that trustworthiness that you spoke about?
You want to hit on that, and I'll add on some.
Pardon me?
You want to start, and then I'll add on some?
Yeah, I guess I'm not totally clear. Could you say a little bit more about what aspects you're talking about?
The information that you regulate ultimately gets used for decision making.
Right.
And so it's one thing to design a trial and think that we got the right outcomes. It's another thing to have credibility in the way in which individual patients and their community providers either believe or don't believe in the evidence generation approach in general.
Well, I think between Amy and I, what we have to stop this, we have to remove this town and gown. We've got to get the community involved in actually generating the evidence. The problem with what they call the fourth translational barrier is the people who are treating patients, many of them, except at the academic center, haven't been privy to the work that's going on and haven't been a part of it. And so it's really hard for them who are used to doing, we do it the X way or whatever, to do it Y way, because they haven't had any part in generating it. And I think the kind of things Amy's working on, which would use evidence from healthcare more broadly, would really instill some credibility, I think, in the feedback loop that's missing right now.
And practically speaking, we really are now trying to open up the conversation to really ask the question, how do we do this? There's a pretty clear trust infrastructure when we say this is regulated by the FDA and it's been approved by the FDA or not approved by the FDA. It's very different when we talk about the idea of this is what good looks like and how as a community we're going to define good that's not specifically about approval by the FDA. And so some of that may ultimately be some practical aspects such as attestation or checklists of what good looks like, or community input of here's what we think needs to be done for this particular product, or how we involve patients in different ways. But right now we need to start with really acknowledging the fact that there's not a trust mechanism or trust infrastructure across this entire space, and ask the question, how do we start to get there?
And I would lastly just say that some of the idea about adopting new ideas has to do with how strongly held the prior beliefs are. As Steve is wanting to say, if your prior belief system is such that, substitute in what you believe as opposed to what evidence, you could look at that slide he showed and said, how much will evidence move you? If there are many things I deal with all the time, like mammography screening, where it is not about fact, it's about belief. And so the ability to change and move people has little to do with the evidence. That's something we have to work on in our training. And get people out of the idea that data should, that we shouldn't be changing and adapting all the time. Everyone should be demanding the iPhone 20, okay? Everybody, patients, physicians, and everyone should get the idea that, okay, this is where we are now. How do we get to make sure that it continues to get better? And so that everyone is responsible for generating the evidence, and everyone has to get feedback on performance. Everyone. That's what new systems are about. Next question.
Hi, this is Aditi Khurana from Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and I actually had two questions. I think the first one's for you, Amy. When you spoke about developing this trust infrastructure and landscape, how do you really envision this playing out in terms of, do you envision, health or tech companies now, driving into the health technology space and coming to FDA for an endorsement of some solutions that they're creating in collaboration with the industry and academia, which integrates, the clinical practice and what we're trying to do in the research setting in the sort of feedback loop that you'd ideally like to see? Or is it more that pharmaceutical companies now go above and beyond and start developing their own data centers that when they come for an approval, they're actually showing how their trial, has a feedback loop to clinical practice just beyond the treatments that they're delivering within the space of the clinical trial?
So how do I envision some of this playing out? And most of this, really, we've been doing our thinking right now in the data and technology space. So innovators who are building solutions that are predominantly software-based, computer-based, artificial intelligence, et cetera. And as we talk about those solutions that are the highest risk, those ones will still be most directly regulated by FDA, software as a medical device. As we start to think about those solutions that are important to the space, for example, of clinical trials or of managing foodborne outbreaks, those solutions themselves are not of highest risk, but we still have to trust those solutions in order to make sure that if I embed them in my clinical trial, whether it's bring my own device or distributed clinical trials or data curation, I can trust that what comes out of this will then be seen as confident enough information that the FDA can make a decision on it. And there I anticipate what we're going to start to see is a distribution of solutions that probably looks more like either attestation or a checklist that you need to demonstrate and fill out, or whether or not you need to get something like some certification, such as high trust or something else. It may be a third party. I think importantly, the government has a role to play in this because the government provides transparency, it provides public input, it makes sure that all stakeholders are involved. And then there are others that really the way that trust is demonstrated is by use across the industry, and we get comfortable with it.
All right, we only have 2 minutes left. It's been a fascinating hour. Too bad you won't give us another hour, but we have 5 people at the microphone. We're going to do something novel. Everyone, try and think about synthesizing your comment and the points you want to make to about 20 seconds, and then we'll all have a final comment. No, so you got your shot. Okay.
First, I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed the insights shared by the panel. And I'm Jen Wilson. I'm actually one of the fellows that graduated from the program. And I got excited about the idea of using real-world evidence either for sort of natural history studies or maybe better defining surrogate endpoints for trials. And I understand that's sort of happening in sort of a patchwork fashion now just by nature of what the data are and where they are and the formats. But I was wondering if the panel could comment sort of on maybe what the incentives or the final structure of that might look like in terms of moving from these sort of smaller efforts to, is it going to be consolidated at the government level, or are companies going to come together to make this? Is it going to be housed as an academic center, or sort of what that final evidence will look like?
Okay, your comment? We're just go ahead. Well, we're just getting people's, we're going to try and get what it is, and then we'll give everyone a final
All right,
comment. 20 seconds.
I'm Bruce Burnett from Duke and Stanford. My second point, or to the second question, would the FDA consider giving up approval based upon a post hoc analysis? And I give an example where a Crohn's disease trial that had a very high placebo effect, this was self-enrolled in terms of patients saying that they were in the middle of a flare. They didn't hit on any endpoint, but when they looked at C-reactive protein for those patients that were enrolled, it hit on every endpoint. The advice from the FDA was that's a good decision, now do the trial again, $20 million. So just wanted to hear whether they would ever consider a statistically strong, valid reason for allowing post hoc analysis for approval.
Should be generated ahead. Okay, next.
Hi, this is Dongli Song from Santa Clara Valley Medical Center as affiliated to Stanford Teaching Hospital. I'm very glad we're talking about reliable and trustworthy data collection and also patient-centered. I think community hospital physicians who are practicing actually have the best relationship with their patients, actually play a central role here. It should have a representative here. Moving forward from the process of
5 seconds.
Yeah. How do we bring them on board?
Great. Next comment.
I'm Mike Gorn, ophthalmic geneticist from UCLA. I think that it's summarizing a lot of the thoughts that were here. I think we actually need to go outside and change the EMR systems so that the certification of them actually includes prospectively identifying patients for trials, providing the templates for adherence, acquiring the data in an appropriate way, and feedback and questionnaires, and finally improving the quality of data so that Dr. Abernathy's comment about accepting imperfect data, we don't have to certify testers for diagnostic tests for every clinical trial, but we can actually use the clinical data generated by the regular studies.
Here, here. Come to poster 16. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Ying Lu from Stanford University, and it's really appreciate the session. I have several comments, but focus on one that Kyle mentioned about get away of hypothesis testing and p-values. I think the problem here is that the p-value itself is not the blame of the whole practice. And p-value is only one of the measurements, like we measure temperature, does not indicate disease, right? So I think Steve actually gave a multidimensional solution, but I don't think the p-value inference will not go away. So I want to pass the message that there's no consensus for statistician community that we will not use p-value.
Well, let's how about this? Let's make p-value be about patient value. There you go.
Okay.
With that, Rosa's going to kick us off the stage. Thanks for a very engaging and enlightening panel.
So I just want to say Laura has set a very high bar for moderators. It was an incredible job. So much information, and I'm sure there are other questions for the panelists in the break. We're going to take a 15-minute break and reconvene. Though we still have seats that are available, so those of you who are in the middle, try to slide to create some openings if you can. And then we also have an overflow room upstairs. Let's reconvene in 15 minutes.